Welcome. Today we're going to be discovering the formula or the math behind how Magic the Gathering works. And so this is going to be particularly useful for people who are interested in constructing decks. And I focus on Limited a lot of the time, and in Limited you're constructing a deck from scratch every single time in every draft. So, but if you're going to be doing this for Standard or some other form of constructed format and you have 60 cards, these things still apply. You can just multiply everything by 1.5 because in Draft you have a 40 card deck, Constructed you have a 60 card deck, and then if you're playing in Commander or Brawl, that you can do this as well, but you just multiply everything by 2.5 to get to the 100 card ratio. So with that, let's dive in. So the magical formula for deck construction for most of your limited decks is 17 lands, 15 creatures, 5 removal, 3 utilities, so 8 total non-creature spells, and your curve is 2 1-drops, 7 2-drops, 6 3-drops, 4 4-drops, 3 5-drops, and 1 6-drop. And we'll get into the math behind why this is the case, but for the vast majority of your decks, this is going to be your ideal curve. But with that, I will explain how I got there. And so what I did is used a hypergeometric calculator to calculate the odds of drawing 1 card by turn 1, and then repeating this process for what are the chances of drawing that 1 card by turn 2, etc., down the lines for 2 cards by turn 3, whatever, right? You can calculate your odds or your percent chance of that occurring. And so the very first thing that we wanted to look at was what's the ideal amount of lands to run in a 40-card deck. So there are 2 things that you primarily want to avoid when addressing a mana base. One is called screw, and being screwed on mana is when you get stuck and you don't have 4 lands by turn 4. And so what I did is I calculated what are the odds that this happens. So if you have 14 cards in your deck, the chances of actually hitting 4 lands by turn 4 is 49.2% on the play and 59.6% on the draw. And the reason why the draw is always going to be higher than the play is because when you're on the draw, you get to have an additional card by turn 4. So you repeat these calculations, and you can see that at 17, you have a 70.9% chance on the play and a 79.9% chance on the draw. And you're trying to hit the ideal situation, right? Like if you wanted to get this all the way up to 100%, then you would run too many lands and you would end up on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is flood. And so it's kind of a strict space that you're trying to hit, right? So flood is when you hit 7 lands by turn 7. And if you're running 17 lands, you've got 25.2% on the play and 35.5% on the draw. And if you go up to 18%, then you start getting to like 44.6% of your games are going to end up flooding out on turn 7. And then 18.5% on the play, 27% on the draw. So you can see kind of between these 2 graphs why there's a debate about whether or not you should be on 16 or 17 lands. So if you're on 17 lands, you have the worst case scenario is the 35.5% on the draw that you're going to flood out. So that's 1/3 of your games where you're going to lose on the draw to flood. And then on the flip side of this, if you're on 16 lands, then 36% of your so 64% of the time on the play you're going to hit 4 lands by turn 4, but that means 36% of the time you are not going to. So there's a balance. If you go with 16 lands, you're worse on the play because you're going to more likely experience getting stuck on less than 4 lands. And then if you're on 17 and you're on the draw, you're likely to flood out. So the real ideal space is somewhere between 16 and 17. And you'll actually see this happen in best of 3. In high competitions where somebody will take out a card when they're on the draw, take out a land, go down to 16 when they're on the draw, and then go back up to 17 when they're on the play. Now, to further investigate, also, I thought since we were talking about mana anyway, this would be a really good time to discuss the correct number of specific kinds of land. So in draft, let's say that you pick 17 lands as your default. Now you have to say how much of that 17 land is specifically a swamp or a plains, right? And so you can calculate the chances that you're going to draw that one correct color of land, so like one swamp or one plains, by turn 1. And so like if you have a 1-drop, if you have a raging goblin for 1 red, then to have a 90% confidence that you're going to hit that land on turn 1, you need at least 10 sources of that color in your deck. So, and it happens to line up very nicely, though, that this 90% carries through. For like a 2-drop, you need to have 9. For a 3-drop, you need to have 8. For a 4-drop, you need to have 7, and on down the line. So it's a nice thing to remember if you're like, okay, how many do I need? Look at your 2-drops and go, okay, each one of these green 2-drops needs 9 sources of green, and you kind of start to figure out why there's some advanced strategies to making sure that the majority of the first part of your, like, turn 1, turn 2, turn 3 is majority 1 color, so that you can choose that color to be your 9 sources. And then the other thing too is double pips. So 2 of the correct lands, like if you have like a Hellkite or something like that has a double pip in red, or a lot of black removal has a double pip in black. And for this one, the 90%, 90% is a little bit too high. So I start this one off with 10 on 3 double pip X. So when you have a total of 5, and it gives you an 85%, which, at turn 5, it's not as important as like curving out on turn 1 by the time that you hit turn 5. But you can start to see just how incredibly difficult, like if you did want a 90% confidence that you were going to be able to play your double pip card on turn 5, that you would need more like 11 sources in your deck to be able to do that. And this brings up another important factor in draft, which is you never splash a double pip card. Say that your main deck is blue black, right? And you have a double pip white card that you want to play. You wouldn't be able to realistically cast that very easily in most decks, because that double pip alone is going to require like 10 sources of white in your deck, and it gets more hard to do even if your thing is much past turn 5 that you're trying, or much before turn 5 that you're trying to do. So like if you have a 1 double pip red, now you need 2 correct lands by turn 3, and I don't have the calculations here, but you have an incredibly high amount of sources, and that's pretty much reserved for when you are only that one specific color. Okay, so in summary, there's kind of the land dilemma, if you will, which is that if you run 16 lands, 36% of the time, you're going to end up being screwed and stuck on land 3 and not being able to hit land 4 on the play. And then when you're running 17 lands, you have a 36% chance of flooding out and hitting 7 lands on turn 7 when you're on the draw. So I think that the default tends to be 16 or 17, though, so you kind of have to decide which one hurts you more, right? Is it worse for your deck to flood out, or is it worse for you to get stuck on your mana? And generally, the more things that you have to do, like the set that's out right now is Wilds of Eldraine, has a lot of things that you can do with your mana. Adventures are 2 cards in 1, you've got mana sinks, like there's a lot that you can do, and generally that means that flood is not as detrimental as getting stuck on a few number of lands. And so in that case, you would want to pick the 17 lands. But hopefully this gives you some insights into why 17 lands is the default that Arena gives you when you're making a drafted limited deck. And So the next step after lands is removal. So once again, get out your handy little calculator and calculate the chances of drawing one piece of removal by turn 5. So most games of Magic do not last much longer than turn 5. And this shows you just how precious that piece of removal is. So another thing that I see a lot of beginners make as a mistake is using their removal on the first target that's available. And especially in limited, you have a limited amount of removal in your deck. So most of the time you try to shoot for at least 5 pieces of removal. And this is because it gives you an 80% chance. So you see there on number 5, 82% and 85.1. So at least an 80% chance of hitting one piece of removal in the match that you play. And then it just increases and gets better from there. And then specifically, if you wanted to hit 2 pieces of removal by turn 5, which is something that you would be interested in doing in a control deck where you were trying to answer to your opponent's plays, then you can see that the ideal situation moves to 8 pieces of removal if you want at least an 80% chance, regardless of play versus draw, to hit the 2 pieces. So, in summary, 5 pieces of removal should be the very bare minimum that you shoot for in every draft. You may hear people say something like draft at least 5 pieces of interaction, and that gives you the 80% chance for one of them by turn 5. And then 8 pieces of removal if you want 2 of them, and I think I use that as the lowest that I will want to go if I am in a controlling archetype. All right, and now for the general curve. So we get our handy little calculator out, and we calculate the chances to draw at least 1 2-drop by turn 2. And you can see here, I cut off everything below 70%. I just decided not to graph, and that's basically like once you get into the point where, you know, a third of the time that you're playing the match, you're just going to miss it. I've decided is not where I'm really interested in looking, right? So 6 is the bare minimum amount of 2-drops that you want to run, and that will not give you the 80% cutoff level. That will give you the 76.4 when you're on the play. So you really want to hit 7 2-drops. And so that this ensures you that 80% of the time, regardless of whether or not you are on the play or the draw, that you can hit a 2-drop on turn 2. So then you can repeat this process on down the line. So how many do you need for 1 3-drop by turn 3? And the magic number for this one is 6. And then 1 4-drop by turn 4. And this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated. And so I decided to graph the entire thing here. But you can see that you need even 5 4-drops doesn't give you the 80% to hit it. But you have to remember that the chance of hitting land 4 on turn 4 is only 75% with 17 lands, and even worse when you have 16 lands or fewer. So with this, we can kind of go, okay, maybe 80% is too high. Let's go for a 70% cutoff. And with that, you can see the magic number is 4 4-drops. And then you can repeat this same process for 1 5-drop by turn 5. For the 80%, you would need 5 5-drops. But the limiting factor on top of the mana is that you also don't want a whole bunch of 5-drops in your opening hand, because if most of the matches are over by turn 5, those can just be dead cards that are sitting in your hand for the entire game. So what you want to do is calculate the chances that you will have 2 5-drops by turn 1 in your opening hand. So this means that it's basically essentially a mulligan to 5 if you do have those 2 5-drops. And we all know that the mulligan to 5 does not do good things. So with this, you can see that around 4 5-drops, you've got a 13.4 and a 17.2% chance of it happening. And then as you start getting to 5, you start getting into that 20%, 25%. of the time is going to basically be a mulligan. And so if you think about the flip side of this, it would be 80% and 75%. And so once you get up to 6, though, now you're starting to see like over a third of your games on the draw. You're just going to be too much. Two of your 8 cards are going to be 5-drops, and it's just going to be too detrimental. So this is why a lot of archetypes, like when people draft ramp, or sometimes control decks, right, where they have just all of this top end that they really want to play, it quickly becomes too crowded. If you have too many 5 and 6 drops in your deck just starts to not function very well, and this is the reason why. And the other thing too to think about is that we don't necessarily need to hit the 5-drop on turn 5. The early plays are more important, where you're expecting to go like turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, and you want a high confidence level that you're going to hit those. And with your 5-drops, you could take a little bit more time, right? Especially if you're in control, or if you're in sort of mid-range deck that's interested in going beyond turn 5. And so the chances to hit one 5-drop by turn 7, you can hit that 80% confidence interval, if you will, with only 4 5-drops in your deck. So to summarize all of it up for you, the curve requirements for the approximately 80%, regardless of whether or not you're on the play or the draw, is 7 2-drops, 6 3-drops, 4 4-drops, and 4 5+ drops. And so this gives you 21 cards, 2 of which are kind of in that flex position, where you could push your 4-drops to 5, and you could push the 5+ drops to 5 if you're wanting to be more controlling, or you could put them in as 1-drops so that you can more easily double spell throughout the turns, or so you get 2 cards that you can kind of move around. And now specifically, what percentage of that curve has to be made up of creatures and not just spells for the time being? And so you can do this calculation. 1 creature by turn 2 is the same thing as 1 2-drop by turn 2, but you can see that if you want an 80% chance to slam a creature down on the board and start affecting the board presence, you need at least 7 in your 40-card draft deck. And so you repeat the same process. What if we wanted to hit 2 creatures by turn 3? And you can see that 79.1 is pretty close to 80%. Yeah, so if we shoot for 11 creatures, that this can include the 2-drops as well, because now you're trying to curve out. You're trying to go 2-drop creature, 3-drop creature, and you can go 2-drop creature, 2-drop creature, still satisfies having the 2 creatures by turn 3. And you can see this starts to push up to 11 creatures in your deck. And then let's say that we didn't want to do any interaction with our opponent, that we just strictly wanted to draw on turn 1 and then play a creature on turn 2, turn 3, turn 4. And to do this, 80% of the time, you would need at least 15 of your creatures to be mana value 4 or less in your deck. And with the 8 with the 8 non-creature spells, that's kind of the entirety of your deck. So, and if you're really trying to go the aggro route, this is why you're going to start looking at 4-cost cards are kind of the tipping point for whether or not your deck is aggressive or mid-range or control. And I'll get into that in a little bit. And then last but not least, let's say that we wanted to have at least 4 creatures by turn 7. This is kind of why the magic number of the why 15 creatures is a number that you may have heard people recommend for beginners to draft. And this gives you at least an 80% chance, regardless of the play or the draw, to hit at least 4 creatures by turn 7. And this gives you enough threats that hopefully you're between your opponent only being able to hit 1 or 2 mana or 2 pieces of removal by turn 7, depending on how much they put in their deck. The 4 creatures should give you enough to ideally close the game, at least in theory. So to summarize, for creatures, we need 7 that are 2 or less, we need 11 that are 3 or less, and we need 15 total. Which kind of gives us the more advanced, or the actual formula for those who were nice enough to watch through the video. And this is the one that I use the most for draft, is 17 lands, 15 creatures, 5 removal, and the curve being 0, 7, 6, 4, 4, with 2 flex spots. And so, 15 creatures plus 5 removal. There's 3 that can go either way. You can bump this up to 18 creatures, or you could do 15 creatures and 8 removal. But you don't want to go less than 15 creatures, and you don't want to go less than 5 removal in an ideal situation. And so this brings me to kind of the pace of a format. So this is not my slide. I grabbed this from 17 Lands, and it's an amazing Magic the Gathering resource. I highly recommend you check it out if you do not already know about it. A very handy tool for draft and data analysis in general. But this is all of the different sets and the average number of turns between you and your opponent. So like if it's turn 4, your opponent is on turn 4, then there's been 8 turns of play. And you can see in the bottom right, the little circle with the dash through it, the 2 circles, that's Phyrexia, all will be 1. And I think the bottom right one is Cube, if I remember correctly. Both incredibly fast formats. And the faster the format, the less amount of turns, so the lower down on the y-axis it's going to be. And the more of an advantage it's going to be on the play. So the play gets to go first. It's the first one to get to turn 4. So if you're going to win by turn 4, you want to be on the play. But as time goes on, then it actually becomes theoretically detrimental to be on the play if you get past turn 5. You'll notice that for this data set, the maximum was 10.1. And so that's what I mean, is most Magic games do not actually last longer than turn 5 from either you or your opponent. But there are a couple of builds where you are intentionally trying to do just that. And there are certain sets that are slower than others. And if you go back far enough in Magic the Gathering time, there used to be an advantage to being on the draw instead of being on the play. But it has been several decades since that was true. But the reason why I bring this up is because you want to keep in mind what you're trying to do with your deck. And so there's 3 basic builds that I would recommend for beginners. And the first one is aggro. Aggro means that you're trying to win before turn 5. You're trying to win before your opponent has had the opportunity to play all of their cards. So if you win by turn 5, let's say your opponent is actually playing a land on every single turn. By turn 5, they only have 15 mana that they could have used in the entire game. And 15 mana is usually not enough to get your entire hand down. And so you're not worrying so much about answering your opponent's threats, you're trying to set the pace of the game. And you may have heard be the beatdown, be the one that's applying the pressure. Then the most common deck that I think 90% of draft really falls into is midrange. And midrange is you're trying to add a little bit more interaction to your deck so that you have responses to your opponent's plays, and you're gonna start going out a little bit further into the late game where you're like, you play your 5-drop, you play your 6-drop, and then you win the following turn, right? And then you've got control, and control's the one that's like, maybe you've heard of Sam Black, who's an amazing Magic the Gathering player. But you're cycling through your entire deck, and at that point it becomes more about figuring out how to inevitably win the game. And you can do things like cycle your library infinitely, or go watch Sam Black for that if you want to figure out how to do that. But so for the next step, if you will, is to adapt the formula for the different builds that you're going for. So let's start with aggro. Let's say that you are let's try to get as completely aggressive as possible. And to do this, let's say that we don't want to just skip our turn 1. Let's say that we actually want to play a creature on turn 1. And so similarly, we go through the process. How many in our deck do we need to actually be able to do this 80% of the time? And we find out that the number is 8. And then we've also got the... it's good to refresh this, right? So the 4 lands by turn 4 is something that we can kind of tweak a little bit, because of if we lower our curve, then let's say we don't have that many 4-drops in our deck, then we can get away with running fewer and fewer lands. So if we decide to run 16 lands in our deck, then we can still hit it 64% of the time. And if we run 15 lands, then we can hit 56.8% of the time on the play, and that's when it's the lowest possible. So we've got the 1 4-drop by turn 4. Let's just we still want to hit the 1 4-drop, right? But if we lower our chances of hitting the land, so if we play 16 lands in our deck, then the chances of hitting that land 4 is no longer 75%. Let's call it 70%, right? And if that's the case, then we can go like, okay, well, maybe the more ideal spot for our 3-draw or a number of 4-drops in our deck is 3, or maybe it's 2. And so you can kind of see that this, as you drop the 4-drops, the number of 4-drops in your deck, it allows you to drop the number of lands to correspond with the chances that you really want to hit land 4 on turn 4. Right? So if you're at 16 lands, 64% to 74% kind of falls within that range of 3. You're covered, even if you go all the way to 64. 63 on the draw is still below the 64. And then same thing, if you go to 2 4-drops, you only have a 44.2, 47.9% chance, and that's less than the 15. So you can kind of balance these two back and forth and go like, okay, well, if I tweak the top end of my deck down, then I can also afford to lower the amount of lands that I'm playing in my deck. And so this is how I came up with my aggro formula. And this one's a little bit hard to actually achieve in draft, just because 8 1-drops is a metric ton. So you're going to see this kind of curve more often in constructed. And so if we go with 3 4-drops as the maximum amount of the top end of our deck, no 5-drops, just maxing out on 3 4-drops, this still gives us a 60% chance to hit a 4-drop on turn 4. And then with 16 lands, we still have a 70% chance to hit land 4. So this works out pretty nicely. Or we could also do this where we could drop the amount of 4-drops to 2. We get a 46% chance of hitting 4-drops on turn 4. But with 15 lands, we've got a 62% chance to hit our land 4. And then this kind of gives us that 2 flex that we can put anywhere we want on the 1, 2, or 3 slot. And then the opposite side of the spectrum is how would we tweak the formula for control? Let's say that one thing that we can definitely note is the 2 pieces of interaction by turn 5. We 100% are going to need at least 2 answers to our opponent's threats by turn 5. So we can start out there with an easy, okay, we need at least 8 removal. And then kind of get into that same thing of like, we want to maximize our amount of late game threats, but we still want to keep it within that range where we aren't going to negatively affect our opening hands and basically have dead cards in our starting hand. And so from here, you can go with the 75% is kind of okay. I don't think 65 is, right? So like once we get to 6 5-drops in our deck, especially when we're on the draw, we just have too high of a possibility of having too many 5-drops in our opening hands. And so with that, I think we really want to keep 5 5-drops is really as much as we want to push it. And I don't recommend going higher than this. And this is something that I see time and time again when people are like, well, I'm a control deck, I'm going to go super late. They still put too much stuff inside their top end of their deck. And then similarly, we can kind of push the 4-drops to 5, but you start running into the issues of whether or not you'll actually have enough mana on turn 4. But you can kind of get away with it on 5. And then, most importantly, you still need the 7 2-drops and the 6 3-drops. They do not have to be creatures, though. If you're playing control, they just need to be answers to your opponent's threats. And so you can go 8 removal is as low as you can go, but you could go up as high as 20. You could run an entire deck of removal, but you would need some sort of win condition. Maybe you just mill your opponent out. But whoops. With that, that's going to be it for me. Thank you so much for watching to the end of the video. This is what happens when I get sick and I have way too much time on my hands. So let me know if you found the video helpful. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Remember to hit like and subscribe. I'm trying to produce daily Magic the Gathering content is the ultimate goal. And, I really do appreciate the feedback, though. So if anybody's got comments, let me know. I love to hear them. And I hope this helps you be a better Magic the Gathering drafter and constructed player. So thank you, everybody. Take care.